Hope we got the right picture. Has everyone gotten the copies of the program and the letter to portfolio managers by Larry Fink, the chairman and CEO of BlackRock? If not, you should get them. You should get them. Or, unless you're in my business organizations class, in which case you've already received it. Way, are we all set? We're all set? Thank you.
Okay, how are you? Welcome everybody out in live feed land as well. This is a very special day, and I'm glad you're all here. This is our chance to honor, to recognize the wonderful Center for Corporate Law and Governance. As I think all of you know, I am new here, but I had a general understanding about what the center did when I interviewed and then when I came over here. And then Professor Eakley and I had a very wonderful lunch and talked about the program and the offerings of the center. And I became very excited as to the role of the center in terms of making sure that Rutgers will be recognized as a top public law school in the United States. We just had a alumni steering committee meeting, and there were three things that came out of that meeting that I think are very important to remember about the center and that really kind of stuck with me. The first is in a real short period of time, in 3 years, the center has put together a broad range of offerings and programs and speakers at a really remarkable and an accelerated pace. And it has done that between the two campuses. In fact, part of the discussion was how the corporate center really preceded in many respects the formal merger between Newark and Camden, and provided, I think, leadership and a guide as to best practices as to what one Rutgers looks like. So it's really important to remember that the center is at the tip of one Rutgers. The second thing that I gleaned from the meeting is that many law schools provide a business education, a sort of law and business, finance and business. And I was talking to our guest speaker about this, and one thing that sort of jumped out is that this is really one of the few law schools that really focuses on issues of governance and compliance. And that is a really very important niche in a very important market, and provides you with very unique education here at Rutgers in business. And the third thing is that, you know, Rutgers has often had a reputation for being a school that is dedicated to issues of social justice. But one thing that really kind of jumped out at me when I talked to Doug and when I started talking to the faculty here is just how well enmeshed the center is within both the law school community and the tradition of Rutgers in that area. And I think that also provides, again, a very unique opportunity, unique educational opportunity. I think many of you probably already know that I'm a big booster of this law school. I think it's a fantastic place, and it's my job to go around and really communicate the story of Rutgers Law School. And I think the story of the center really intersects nicely. The narrative of the center really intersects nicely with the history of the school with the history of the recent history of Rutgers, and our ambition always to be one of the finest law schools, one of the finest public law schools, and an innovative place of learning. So it's with that I open the program and welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Lopez. Arthur, my co-director of the center, Arthur Levy, is here from Camden, as is Jacob Russell's, our esteemed colleague. I don't know whether, Arthur, you wanted to say anything, or we've said most of it at our joint meeting before. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction because you have a summary of Matthew J. Mallow's bio, but there is a slight correction. He's moved beyond his responsibility for the BlackRock Investment Stewardship Group, and he's now senior advisor to that group. I'm particularly gratified that Matt has agreed to come and visit with us, because it was some 2.5 years ago that I read an article in the New York University Journal of Law and Business, co-authored by Matt, on the subject of shareholder engagement, and proposing a middle course between short-termist emphasis on shareholder empowerment at the expense of boards of directors versus protecting boards of directors from shareholder incursions. And one of the things that Matt noted in his article was that there wasn't very much research going on around on the subject of how especially asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard, State Street advisors, engage or should engage with the management of their portfolio companies, and what should they be advocating for in that engagement process. I called Matt and I said, does anybody else express an interest in trying to figure out how to do the kind of research you're advocating? And even though the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court had called in Leo Strine and others, much to my surprise, nobody else had said, gee, this was a seminal article and a very direct point aimed at academe. So Matteo Gatti and I called up Doug Shaw, the executive director of the Conference Board Governance Center, met with Doug and his Matteo Tonello to say, we'd like to scope out a research project that at least gets somewhere in the direction that Matthew Mallow has been advocating. And that was the start. We have a 2-year research contract with the Conference Board Governance Center, including a lot of sophisticated analytics being performed by a company in India. But that was all precipitated by Matt, and that's so great to have him over here for our opening session. So, Matt Mallow.
Doug, thanks for that very kind introduction. I think giving me credit for the origin of the center is far more than I deserve. This was clearly Doug's and Arthur's idea that I just happened to be, at the point in time, giving some slight sense of legitimacy to what no one else had ever done before. And they deserve a huge amount of credit for starting this center, for the way the center has operated for the last 3 years, for the range of activities that I just heard, as the Dean just said, when we sat with the Advisory Council for the last hour. And they're all activities which no one else, to the best of my knowledge, is doing, and they're filling not only a niche, but they're filling an important role in the relationship between governance and not only corporate law, but the actual practice of what do I do as a general counsel on a day-to-day basis, and how do we guide both our managements and our directors, all of whom look to lawyers for that guidance. So Doug, all credit goes to you and Arthur, not at all to me, but I'm delighted to be here and to participate with you. So let me spend a few minutes, let me spend 2 minutes more on my background so you'll understand where I'm coming from. For 3 years I was the founder and I ran the corporate finance department at a law firm called Skadden Arps. One of my large clients, when I took public, with the company BlackRock. At the time BlackRock went public in the late 90s, there were 300 employees, and it was basically a fixed income investment management firm. I was a corporate finance lawyer. My colleagues who did investment advisory work did the work for BlackRock. Fast forward 10 or 12 years later, I retired, literally retired from Skadden Arps, and decided I wanted to teach and keep my hand in. So I called my friend, the then general counsel of BlackRock, and he said, well, come be my consultant. So I grabbed that and did it. And I taught a course at one of your competitive law schools across the river in southern Manhattan, NYU. And a year and a half later, Larry Fink asked it, when my friend decided after 25 years of being general counsel of BlackRock, enough was enough, my friend Larry Fink asked if I would be general counsel. So he put a corporate finance lawyer in charge of an investment management firm, in charge of both legal and compliance. They both reported to me on a worldwide global basis. And at the time I took that job, there were about 250 people in the department. The firm employed 11,000 people. The sun never set on BlackRock. There were offices around the world. And when I handed it over 5 years later to my successor, and I became a vice chairman of BlackRock, there were 450 people in the legal and compliance department, and there were 14,000 employees of BlackRock, with $6.3 trillion, T.S. Thomas, trillion dollars of assets under management. So that gives you a little sense of my background, my experience. And to those of you who are students, let me just say that the reason I was hired to be general counsel of BlackRock was not my expertise in investment management, of which I had virtually none. It was rather because the reason people hire you as general counsel is they trust your judgment, and they expect judgment from you, not necessarily expertise. Those 450 people who worked in, my colleagues who worked with me, they had expertise. So that's just a notice and a warning to you that if somebody offers you an opportunity in an area that you don't know anything about, but it's a good opportunity, take it. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, take it. So let me spend a little more time telling you why does BlackRock care about engagement? Why do we care at all? And how do we go about doing it? So let me contrast for you what I would roughly categorize as three types of engagement routines. One is the activist. They claim that they provide the necessary and salutary discipline to corporate management, and they're at one side. Another side are those who support uncritically and without any hesitance management or the directors, and just automatically re-elect directors, no matter what their deficiencies may be. So those are the two extremes, and obviously this is a bit simplified for the purpose of this discussion, but those are the extremes. We are in the middle. We do not do what activists do. We don't do what the uncritical management supporters do. And why is that? So we manage, as I said, $6.3 trillion of assets, and 2/3 of those are managed on behalf of people who are either retirees or saving for retirement. So they have a very long-term horizon. And in fact, now, post-retirement can often be quite substantial in terms of years. So you have to think about not only the accumulation phase, pre-retirement, but you got to think of the decumulation phase after retirement. So 2/3 of our ultimate end holders of our products are retirees or savings for retirement. Now we manage that around the world, and half there are investment managers in London, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in San Francisco, and so on. Now, about half of those $6.3 trillion of assets are in equity securities. And of the equity securities, $2.5 trillion are in index-related products. Those could be index mutual funds, they could be collective trust funds of the bank that we run, or they could be in iShares and exchange-traded funds, ETFs. So the index strategies are 2.5 trillion of the out of roughly 3.5 trillion of equity assets. The rest of the assets are either fixed income or alternative assets or many other classes. So you notice I've said index investing. You won't hear me call it passive investing, which is the way you read about it. You read about it as active versus passive. We have active and we have index. And you'll see as I have discussed this with you, why we don't call it passive. Because we're not passive. We are actually engaged. Right? We're not engaged in the way the activists are, but we are definitely engaged. Now, we are also ever mindful that we are fiduciaries. There is a whole lot of, been a whole lot of controversy in the last couple of years about the Department of Labor, potential Department of Labor rule on fiduciaries, are brokers going to be fiduciaries, and so on. We are fiduciaries. We have been under the Investment Company Act of 1940. We are there. The Advisors Act of 1940, we're fiduciaries. And we are understanding that we don't own or have any interest, economic interest, in that $6.3 trillion. Not a penny of that is ours. That's all client money. So we owe our clients a duty of care, a duty of loyalty that's appropriate for being a fiduciary. And we are respectful, or at least we try to be respectful, every day of that obligation. Also, our clients pick the strategy they want to invest in. We, on their behalf, are bound to follow their guidelines that they give us. Those guidelines can be embedded in a mutual fund, they can be embedded in an ETF, or if you're a large pension fund, you can have a separate account, and they're embedded in an investment management agreement that we sign with them. The investment results accrue entirely to the client. The good results and also the not so good results. There are times when we don't make clients a lot of money. The good and the bad are for the clients. We get paid a fee. And typically, that fee is not dependent on the result. It is a small management fee. Whatever it's worth, I will tell you, if you figure out our revenue divided by excuse me, our assets, you'll see that it's about 20 or 25 basis points per dollar of management. And what that means is that we are much like a big supermarket. We are scale, we are volume, we make our funds by small increments, very small increments actually, but we make it up by doing a lot. So think about for the moment that basic fact that most of our ultimate holders are planning for retirement or are retired. And think about what that means from the point of view of how we have to manage our investments. And what that has driven us to, and we would like to say we'd be there anyway, but what it has certainly driven us to is long-term investing. We believe in being an investor for the long term. Now, nobody quite defines what the long term is, but it's a horizon that extends quite far into the future, and we seek to promote activities that generate long-term returns. Index funds. What are index funds? Index funds are investment vehicles that seek to replicate the economic result of a particular index. So you've all heard of the Dow Jones Index, you've all heard of the S&P 500. We seek to replicate and promise our clients that we'll do our best to replicate whatever the result of those indices are. Now, no individual can go out and buy the S&P 500. It's an index, it's a calculation, it's done by a computer. You can't go out and buy it unless you can buy all 500 securities in the index, which it's hard to do as an individual. and keep them in the right proportion one to the other, because there's a rebalancing that occurs for a lot of reasons. But we can do it because of our scale. Now, Vanguard does it, State Street does it, and a dozen other people do it. But BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are the principal purveyors of index products. And what it means, though, is that we are pretty much required to hold those securities, all 500 in the S&P case, until such time as the companies are no longer in the index. If they're in the index, we don't have the luxury of saying, gee, we don't like what the company's results, so let's sell it. Active managers do. Active managers can buy and sell a company at any time based on their analysis of the merits of the company. So we replicate the index essentially by buying the component parts. There are thousands of indices that can be invested in. You've all heard of the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, probably heard of the Russell 2000, maybe the FTSE 100, but trust me, there are literally thousands more that exist around the world, and we offer products that replicate about 300 of those, I think, something in that order. So, as long-term holders, as required long-term holders for that $2.5 trillion of index products, how can we make how can we fulfill our fiduciary duty to our clients? And the only way we can do that, in our view, is through our voice and our vote. Not all clients give us, by the way, the right to vote their securities, even if we are the ones picking what securities they own. But for the most part, let's assume that we get to do the vote. So it's through our voice and our vote that we can exercise and fulfill our fiduciary obligation. And what is the voice and vote? That is engagement. That is the basic part of engagement. Now, we do engagement through an ESG lens, environmental, social, and governance. But we do think that good governance, the G part of ESG, is the foundation for good long-term performance. And you often find that the E and the S come along if the company has good governance. If it doesn't, we are prepared to talk to companies and see if they will come along. We don't have a political agenda, but we do use and exercise our voice. One way is through the letter that you have, all sitting here, excuse me, which is the 2018 edition of our CEO's letter to CEOs, to the Fortune 500 CEOs. There's an equivalent version that goes to Japanese companies. There's another version that goes to European companies, but they're all essentially the same, translated into the appropriate language. So, while we don't have a political agenda, I can tell you that that letter certainly engendered a political response. And we have been accused by people on the right, conservative, of being socialists. We have been accused by progressives and people on the left of being unduly tied to financial returns and not giving nearly consideration to the social and or environmental issues. So I guess from our performance, being the object of a slight level of vilification from both sides, may suggest that we're doing something right. But the reason that both sides can look at us through the lens that they find appropriate is in part because of the letter of 2018. Because the letter of 2018 talked about the importance of, the letter of 2018 is the fifth in a series of annual letters. It didn't come full-blown all by itself. It was based on and built upon prior letters. And the letter of 2018 did say that in addition to making clear your corporate strategy, CEO, please make clear your corporate strategy. It also said every company ought to have a purpose. A purpose, and a purpose which understands and takes into account the environment, takes into account the climate in which they live, and climate being social, not just the weather, in which they live, the communities, and other varieties of stakeholders. And that's what we mean by purpose. So what's the purpose? So what's BlackRock's? To give you an example. What's BlackRock's purpose? BlackRock's purpose is to try to assure the financial well-being of our clients, right? To provide our clients with a better financial status than before they came to us. That's not our strategy. That's our purpose. That's what we're here for. We're not here to make earnings per share, nor does the letter intend to be satisfied if someone says our purpose is to make money for our shareholders. That's not a social purpose. That we believe that combining purpose with an appropriate strategy for implementing the purpose will produce economic, financial results that are far better than if you had neither purpose nor strategy. So how do we engage with companies? How do we do this, right? We have a professional group of about 35 people today. We've announced that we're going to double it, maybe it's 40 people today, because we've announced we're going to double it to 70 over the course of the next 3 years. By the way, and if you want to go into the world of investment stewardship, come see me. We can talk about it as a career, because it is a career, and people who do it are really quite professional at it. Those 35, 40 people have vote the shares that our clients have allowed us to vote, and they vote at 17,000 annual meetings a year, 17,000 around the world. There are far more meetings per company in Asia than there are in the United States. Asian companies often have 2 or 3 meetings a year for reasons that are too long to explain, but they do. And each meeting may have a dozen items on the agenda, because you have each director you can vote for, plus appointment of auditors, and if that's all they have, that's just a normal plain vanilla meeting. But they may have a shareholder proposal or 2. They may have a contested election for directors and the like. So we obviously can't meet with 17,000 companies a year. So we don't even try. And most of it is routine and not controversial. But we do meet with 1,500 companies a year, which, think about that, and that's a lot. And the point of doubling the size of our resources is to better enable us to engage more in depth with those 1,500, or to expand that 1,500 to a slightly bigger number. But I don't expect it's going to get hugely bigger over time. Vanguard and State Street also have investment stewardship groups. They're slightly smaller than ours, and their statistics are roughly equivalent in terms of their meeting. So that's the background. That tells you what we do, tells you that we're not uncritical investors. I guess the one other thing I haven't told you is that, I don't know how many of you have heard of ISS and Glass Lewis. They are proxy advisory firms. They will tell you, they will examine each and every company, public company's proxy, and then give their recommendations on how one should vote at their meetings. Obviously, we know what they say, what they recommend, and we have a very good idea of their basic guidelines, but we've created our own. We don't follow ISS, we don't follow Glass Lewis, we've created our own. All of this is available on our website. All of this is available on our website. Our website is only slightly more navigable than getting to the Senate's website. So here's how you do it. You go to blackrock.com, and at the top of the page, there is a heading which says our firm or something of that sort. It's a drop-down menu. It's the first drop-down menu on the left. I've forgotten exactly what it says. Halfway down, there's something called investment stewardship. Click on that, and you will see basically all of what I've just told you. You'll see it in more depth, you'll see it in greater detail, and you'll see other things about investment stewardship. We report our investment stewardship. It's required in the US for mutual funds to report how they voted, but we report those votes. We report some controversial votes at the time the vote is taken, contemporaneously, so while it's still news, rather than wait for 6 months when we might otherwise have to report it. We don't do that on every one. And that's the basic element. Go look at the website. So, how does this all relate to activists and management supporters? So, people believe that activists are generally short-termers. They generally want to shake up a company. They think there's underperformance. They do it through public campaigns, proxy fights, nominating of directors, takeovers. They propose strategies for the company, and they are certainly not shy about expressing all of their views. A recent campaign that you may have read about was the Tryon campaign to elect one director at Procter & Gamble. Tryon would tell you that they are not an activist investor because their average holding is 7 years. That's not short term, therefore they can't be an activist investor. They exhibit every other characteristic of an activist investor, including nominating directors, making proposals, having a strategy for the company, and so on. On the other side, the what I call management director supporters, are generally long-term, but basically status quo institutions or voters. They give great deference to the incumbents. They rarely, if ever, vote against an incumbent. They believe in their hearts that the management knows best about the company and an outsider really doesn't, notwithstanding the disclosures that public companies are required to make. And they are often accused of being uncritical. So they support things that insulate directors, things like staggered boards. The activists, it's anathema to them, a staggered board, or any of the other defensive techniques. So those are where they are. We, as I told you, set our own guidelines and we set our own path. We believe in patience for a while. We believe in patience and we make recommendations to management, but not about how to run the company. We believe that the board of directors is responsible for the supervision of the management and the selection of the management. And what we are concerned about is what's the governance, principally concerned about, what's the governance at the board level? Do the directors participate in the creation of the company's strategy? We don't tell, we wouldn't tell Coca-Cola to get out of the business of using enhanced sugar in their products. That is for them to decide. But we do care that the board of Coca-Cola has people on it who are qualified to talk about what are the effects of that, or other things they ought to be doing, one way or the other. And similarly, with an oil company, we don't tell them to stop drilling and stop accessing hydrocarbons. But we do care that an oil company thinks about climate and climate change disclosure. And what are they doing to prepare for the day, which maybe some oil companies will tell you the day is so far in the future it's not worth preparing for, but they may prepare for the day when hydrocarbons are no longer the basis of our society. So we care about people having enough boards, having enough expertise to actually challenge the management and to make them accountable. And so those are the things that we look at and that we talk to directors about. We expect when management comes to meet us that they bring along a director. There are, I would say, of the Fortune 500, overwhelmingly they do that. But not everyone. There are companies that don't want to do that, and it's certainly a new world for directors to think that they've got to go talk to investors. Right? Now bear in mind that because of our index funds, we have control, not ownership, it's our clients, not us, control of positions that range from basically 3 to 6%, in some cases slightly bigger, in virtually every public company in the world. Not quite, but virtually. And you would think that with only 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7, 8, 9% of a company, managements wouldn't be terribly attentive to us. But I can tell you that that's not true. They are attentive to us. They do listen to us. And they do care about what we think. And an example of that is, again, go back to the Trion P&G proxy fight. There were 200 and something billion, B as in boy, billion shares of P&G. It's a really big company. The vote was decided by 50,000, 60,000. It's not so clear which way the vote was. And counting ballots in a corporate election is much akin to counting ballots in Florida in 2000. It's really no different. It's very tough to do with any degree of accuracy. So that's what we do. We set goals and priorities for each year. For this year, we have 5. The 5 are governance, first. And by that, we mean board composition, board effectiveness, accountability, the things I've just talked about, board leadership, diversity on a board. And we don't mean just the obvious diversity of gender and race. We mean that, but we don't mean only that. Because we also mean, we think that a board with a variety of backgrounds, economic backgrounds, geographic backgrounds, potentially educational backgrounds, professional backgrounds, all bring to the mix a better, more likely to produce a better result than if all the members of the board were just the CEO's longtime friends and acquaintances. So we care about diversity. The second is corporate strategy. Because as I said, we don't tell people what corporate strategy they should adopt, and we don't so much care as to what it is, although in some broad strokes we obviously do. But we care about how it's developed, what's the board's role in developing the corporate strategy, and as I discussed with Larry Fink's letter, you can see that we care much more about things like, in addition to strategy, purpose, and how that purpose is going to be implemented along the way. By the way, much has been made of the fact that Milton Friedman said the only purpose of a corporation is to make money for the shareholders, plain and simple. He didn't actually say it quite that boldly, but that's the way it's quoted all the time. But corporations, for as long as I've practiced law, have actually done some of the things that Larry has now emphasized in his letter. So every year they have to figure out how much do we pay employees? How do we allocate our revenue as between investment in the business, for short-term or long-term, what are we doing? How do we allocate our revenue between employees and shareholders and suppliers and communities? And corporations have been doing that for years and years and years, ever since probably the founding of the corporation. They never thought of it as part of a modern-day governance. But it's clearly an acceptable and important part of what we do. We call it budgeting, but it is an everyday occurrence. Third is compensation. Again, we don't care so much about the size of the compensation. We are not opposed to paying people very well, provided that it's aligned with the long-term goals, the long-term purpose, the long-term strategy, and there is performance. Not performance in the stock price necessarily, because that's a lot of that's beta. A lot of it is the market rising or falling, and frankly, the CEO doesn't control that. But the CEO can control do things to control revenue, you can do things to control expense and the like, and I can tell you that the BlackRock compensation plans are based entirely on, they were in the old days based on market stock price, but they're now entirely based on factors that are within the control of management. So There are about controls of expenses in various ways, the controls of organic growth of assets, how do we grow the business, and so on, and various other things, all of which is in our proxy statement, by the way. Our fourth item this year is climate risk. We want to understand through disclosure how a company, particularly those that are affected or obviously to be affected by climate risk, how they're going to manage them. And the oil companies, frankly, have responded. You may have seen in the newspaper, there was a shareholder proposal last year at Exxon about this issue, and we voted for the shareholders. We voted against the management. It's also no secret, by the way, we voted for Tryon to elect a director. So we sided with an activist on one hand, a shareholder on the other, but I can also give you 12 examples where we voted for the management proposals. So just to wrap up, how are we different than activists? We never make a proposal to be put on the ballot. We never seek board representation, and we have a much longer investment horizon. We also don't generally seek publicity. Why are we different than the folks who uncritically support management? Because we follow our own view of what constitutes good governance. We think good performance, as I said, follows good governance. And we don't uncritically support management if we think there are deficiencies, and if our patience has been exhausted. We will vote and have voted against management. A classic example is say on pay. If we don't like the pay arrangements, we actually don't vote against say on pay because we can't understand why say on pay resolutions either fail or get 60%, but the directors who adopted the pay get 90% of the vote. This doesn't make entire sense to us. So we will vote against the chair of the compensation committee if we think their say on pay is for some reason egregious. The pay is egregious. None of this happens all that often, but it does happen. So that's the middle road. We started this by saying that the center was founded because of, or at least in some measure as a result of reading the article that I wrote, and I just think I ought to reveal to Doug and to all of you that my co-author, Jasmine Sethi, who was a member of the Legal and Compliance Department, deserves much more credit for that article tonight. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
So we have a couple of minutes for a few questions. We've got a roving microphone to get the question so that those on the film can hear it. But just raise your hand if you have a question, Paul.
Yeah. Thank you. In the interest of full disclosure, I have to tell you that this is the first time I believe I've seen Matt Mallow in almost 50 years. I'm Paul Trachtenberg. I joined the faculty here in 1970. Shortly before, Matt and I were among a small group of young associates at New York law firms who started something called the Council of New York Law Associates, which has morphed into an enormously important organization, the Lawyers Alliance. But the point, and what I've been mulling over in connection with your comments, and I'll get to a question very quickly, is that one of the programs we ran with the Council of New York Law Associates involved a lunch presentation by Adolph Burley. I don't know how many people know him, but he's a towering figure. The modern corporation.
He was still alive 50 years ago.
Right, he was. And he gave a presentation which was consistent with his view and very much related, I think, to what you've been talking about and describing in terms of BlackRock, because he challenged us. He said, you know, the more distant shareholders become from a corporation in which they have invested, the more the whole investment process looks like a big crapshoot. And what if one day shareholders as a group wake up and say, you know, I don't think I'm going to engage in this behavior anymore. What would the economic impact be? And it seems to me what you're describing by way of BlackRock and its role, it tries to mediate between that. It tries to give voice to shareholders, not maybe individually, but collectively in ways that given our economy, shareholders can't, unless they're large players, can't really exercise over huge and growing corporations. And I wondered if you thought about that as an antidote to Adolf Early's concern expressed to a group of young lawyers many years ago.
So my memory of that luncheon is not nearly as clear as yours, Paul. So I think the answer is unfortunately no. We haven't actually thought about it or talked about it, but it's an interesting idea and it's an important one. What we do think about it though is in terms of the fiduciary duty of how do we perform our role as providing for the financial future and well-being of our clients. And there's now a whole stream of academic literature, from the law school academic literature, that suggests that index funds should not vote. That says we have no interest in voting. We have no interest in voting because we don't care what the results of the index are. All we care is that we replicate the results so that our client gets what the index provides. If they get less, they get less. If they get more, they get more. Now, we, of course, reject that, right, in every possible way. We reject that analysis and say, you know, if we didn't vote, we being the institutions, not just BlackRock, but they would eliminate Vanguard, State Street, and depending on where you make the cutoff, you could eliminate 40, 50%, 60% of the shareholders of a company. So what does that do? That would leave the company at the whim of management to some extent, retail shareholders who typically vote less unless they happen to be somehow connected to the company, and activists. That's who you leave it to. So we don't think that makes any sense, nor do we think that it makes any sense to put our clients at the risk of those groups without us having at least a say in how things go on. So we think of it as a fiduciary duty issue, not so much as what would happen to the state of corporate America or corporation in the world.
Arthur, hold on one sec.
Oh, I can speak up.
Well, but it's not going to get picked up on the video.
Oh, okay. So I thought that was a great talk. Thank you very much. I encourage my students from Camden to come up. I don't see many of them here, and it's really their loss. I was very excited about this, and that was
Watch the replay.
That was interesting. Yes, and I will require them to do that.
That's torture.
So I wanted to ask a question that pushes back a little bit on the Larry Fink letter and get your thoughts about this. And maybe this is low-hanging fruit, and you might have expected a question like this, but that's okay. So there's language in the letter about building shareholder value, which is the kind of language that one would expect to see. There's also language about benefiting all stakeholders, including local communities. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. And the question is whether this is trying to be sort of all things to all people. So the question is, sometimes it seems to me that those two can be inconsistent. And let me just give you an example. So what would you do in the case where you've got a company that decides to move all of its plants offshore, right? Because that's going to result in substantial savings, and that's going to help the bottom line significantly and result in great shareholder value, but clearly that's going to hurt the local community, no question. That seems fundamentally, those two seem inconsistent. And I realized during your talk, you talked a little bit about, well, we just, to some ways, leave this up to the board, but I don't know. The question is, what would you do if there were a shareholder vote on something like that, and it was really put to you, and you couldn't back away and say, oh, we just want to make sure that the board is carefully deliberating over that. That's not, you don't get that out, right? Because there's a proposal, a shareholder proposal, and you've got to actually opine. Where do you stand on that kind of a question?
So just like judges who are up for confirmation at the Supreme Court, I don't answer hypotheticals. It would be a case-by-case analysis of what we do. Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, just introduced a bill this last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, which would federalize corporate law. We'd all get federal charters, and would put, I think it's 40% of the board in the hands of employees. And she cites Germany as being an example of that, although I don't think Germany actually has 40%, but they do have some employee representation. Look, those stark questions like that will certainly put us ultimately to the test of how do we balance. We don't purport to say that we've become social warriors. We don't purport to say we, will always come down on the side of the social good as opposed to the shareholder good, if those are in opposition, which they rarely are, by the way, but if those are in opposition. So we do believe we're capitalists, and we do believe in making money for our shareholders, but we believe that generally worrying about the community and worrying about the environment and worrying about the social norms of the societies in which we operate, which, by the way, we're regulated by 80 regulators around the world. 80 different countries have regulations that affect us. But operating within those jurisdictions will produce better results. Will produce better results. Now, if somebody were to say we're going to offshore everything, that would put us to it'd probably an extreme test. But we purport to balance. We don't purport to say they're equal, and we don't purport to say that we're going to always side with what the progressive side of the equation would want us to.
So one more question, and then we can continue the conversation upstairs at the reception. We need a mic. Oh, you've got the mic. Good.
Alex Gonzalez, Assistant General Counsel for New Jersey Resources. I'm one of the only former students, I guess, that listened to Professor Levy and Kane. Thank you for speaking today. I have a question because we're, as a company, fair enough. Yeah, there's one in the back there. As companies are dealing with ESG scoring, obviously we follow as an issuer that's held by BlackRock, your guidelines and that sort of thing. But generally, as an industry, there are ESG scoring agencies, ISS, MSCI, and Bloomberg, I guess more prominently, in terms of the direction that the industry is heading in a leader, right? Because if you look at ISS, they may be viewed as the leader in the proxy voting space, but not so much clear. It's not so clear in the ESG space. So wondering if you could opine on maybe which agency you may look to or follow more, or where you might see the industry heading towards a leader, which ultimately would help companies look to disclosure in the proper way, or in the way that would be most uniformly receptible to the investors.
So we manage, I've forgotten the number, but it's many billions, not trillion, of ESG funds, right? Funds that are, but most of those are screens and filters. Don't buy tobacco, or don't buy gambling, or don't buy oil, or don't buy whatever the particular thing is. And I believe, and I'm not an expert in this area, so I believe that we think of MSCI as basically the only real resource out there, and it's not as good as it ought to be, right? It's not where it ought to be. But I don't think we follow necessarily any of it. And the person you should talk to is a fellow named Brian Deese, D-E-E-S-E, who runs the ESG investment group at BlackRock. And he'll give you a pretty good sense. He was Obama's one of Obama's principal negotiators of the Paris Climate Accord.
Thank you.
That's unfortunately worth these days.
I think we're out of time for this session, but adjourn now so that we can continue upstairs.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned before, we have a reception waiting on the second floor atrium. Just go up the stairs one floor, and there will be. So thank you.